Yeah. Let's get after it. This side's better. You want to go over here? No? You okay? All right, then we'll just go for it. That's a first. Nobody's ever wanted to take my picture before. So, wow. I love being around leaders and pastors just like you. What a privilege. Thank you so much for what you do in your ministry. If you've never been part of a church or part of a church staff or part of a church leadership team, you really don't know what it's like, do you? To engage in ministry. All the joys, all the hurts, all the pains, all the hassles, all the headaches, all those things go into a rich ministry experience, and you are the front lines of doing that. So thank you for what you do. My job this afternoon and through the balance of the time here is to spur your thinking around how is it that we fund ministry that we do. Great question. I noticed that Michelle introduced me when she said, to talk about the difficult subject of money. Oh, thank you, Michelle, for that little introduction there. But isn't it hard to talk about money in a church context? It's awkward. It can be weird. It could be, what are my boundaries? How does this work? We're going to explore this afternoon how you as a leader can expand the giving of your church and doing so in a way that honors your culture, in a way that is sustainable. If you'd like, we have created a resource that you can download right now. If you go to generous.com/GCI, and you can download that, or you can fill out the form and that will be emailed to you, however that is working. So you can download that resource. There are other resources available to you at no cost there. Another advantage is that you can answer email and pretend like you're downloading the resource. So if you want to get caught up on email, just say, I'm downloading that resource, and do what you need to do there. A little bit about Generous, as Michelle mentioned, 25 years old, 35 of us scattered around the country that coach churches and organizations in all things generosity. This is my 18th year in doing this, and I love what I do. It's a privilege to come alongside churches and to coach and encourage in answering the question, how is it that we fund abundantly what God has called us to do? Main idea is that creating a culture of giving will revolutionize your church and your personal leadership. Churches are often very silent, cautious, wary about normalizing the concept of giving within a church context. And rather than creating some shields and backing off on that, we find that churches that normalize the conversation of giving and how do faith and finances intersect really revolutionize what goes on. Not only answering the question of where do faith and finances intersect, but where do faith, finances, and my church intersect, answering those questions and helping people to understand sound biblical principles around that will revolutionize your church and your pastoral leadership. So let's unpack as to what that looks like. What I love about leaders, and this is a list that's not original to me, but it ends up with a surprising characteristic. Leaders have the characteristic of identifying where God is at work and wooing others to join God in that process. That's a quality about you. You identify where God is at work and woo others into you. Secondly, leaders' hearts are aligned with the vision. You're passionate about what God has called you to do. Your heart beats where God's heart beats, and you want to continually invite others into that process. And your personal commitment runs deeply about what God has called you to do. Third characteristic is that leaders lead with a yes and ask how a little bit later. We're always people, men and women of action, saying we're going to pursue where God is taking us. We'll figure it out a little bit later. The how is always in submission to the vision and mission that God has called you to do. But leaders can be intentionally reckless because we're following God. We're following where God wants us to go. Leaders take risk. This is almost a definition of leaders. We're willing to go out there where nobody else wants to go. We blaze the trail. We're pioneers. We make it possible for others to go forward. And the last characteristic of leaders, surprising, is that leaders understand that money follows vision. And this is where we handcuff ourselves as leaders often, where we come to how do we finance this thing, and we go, I don't know. So we're going to handcuff ourselves and not really address it, which is not a good place to be. Scriptures are full of all kinds of conversations about faith and finances. Those two are intricately locked together. You help a person in their faith by helping them to engage in their finances, and their finances help them to engage in faith. We'll unpack that as we go. So leaders understand that money follows vision. Now, for many of you, when you saw the title, Growing a Generosity Culture, and talking about money, you had some kind of an emotional reaction, most likely. As I work with churches across the country and talk with leaders and people in churches, there's an emotional reality when it comes to money. So let's walk through your reactions as what that would have been if just as a person. So some of you reacted to the topic of faith and finances because your world is now more on a subsistence side of things than a robust side of things. There's just not enough income each month to meet the expenses. And that gap there causes emotional angst and pain. I know in my own marriage of 30 plus years, our biggest issues have been around finances. And particularly in our early years of marriage, when we were running out of cash each month, that was no fun, right? Most of us have been there, right? Either right now or early in life where there's just not enough and it creates angst, bad for the marriage. Others of you reacted because you're struggling with money. You have enough coming in, but there's not an abundance of that, and it kind of gnaws it in your brain cells, doesn't it? And it gnaws in your heart over time. And that's where a lot of people are, particularly in American households. We've seen study after study where it says 50%, 60%, depending upon the study, of American households do not have $500 in cash reserves to cover an emergency expense. So as I look out over this fine-looking group of leaders, half of you may not have $500 to meet an emergency expense. So you might be reacting because you're struggling in your private world around that. You may be stable in your giving. You have free cash flow, and hey, this is okay. Not a bad thing to talk about because I'm at a stable place. Some of us are secure, and some of us actually have a surplus of dollars. So depending upon where you are on that emotional range, it causes you to react uniquely to the topic of money. So understand that is just not, I'm teaching the scriptures about the Bible and people should obey and salute the flag and make that work. It's much more complicated than that because people have emotional reactions to money. We have to wade through the reality of where they are and offer them a pathway forward to where they would say, God has an answer for meeting my needs financially, and God has an answer for how I handle my money, how I steward these things. You may also have reactions as a leader in your church. Leaders have different realities as they lead the church congregation. Sometimes leaders are in that same emotional bind of, we know what God wants us to do, we just don't have enough money to figure it out here. How are we going to pay that bill? How are we going to fund that experience going to join a sister church somewhere in another part of the world? How are we going to fund that intern? How are we going to send that student to college? How are we going to do these things? So as leaders, oftentimes we get that angst going because we don't really know what to do. Sometimes you want to do that and you even know how to do that, but there's a fear factor involved there because once we start talking about money, people will react and challenge you in your leadership. It was an interesting study that was done about a year ago now. This cracked me up. 57% of Americans would rather have a naked picture of themselves online than show their private financial checkbook register. going back to, would you paint me in the nude? Still a little disturbed by that story, but isn't that crazy? Almost 6 out of 10 of you would rather post a naked picture of yourself online than show your personal finances. What's with that? So it's awkward, it's hard, even as leaders, to talk about money. When was the last time somebody said, tell me about your giving patterns? Tell me about your giving story. How has God blessed you and how do you give? Oh, that's like jumping into a political conversation, isn't it? Ask me about my sex life. I'd rather talk about that than talk about my finances with that. So as pastors and leaders, we have all kinds of reactions around that. So let's call it like it is, that we do have reactions. So creating a culture of giving will revolutionize your church and your leadership, and we'll continue to walk that through. Where most churches are now, I get to work with churches every day and love it. Here's where most churches are. There's a vision of where God wants them to go that is robust, that is grand, that is God-honoring, that is passionate, that is risk-filled, that is something to live for. And the finances are down here. Just not enough to hit what God wants us to do. So you have two options at this point. You either shrink the vision to live within your financial world, or you increase the giving to meet where God has called you to go. It's a lot easier to cut expenses and to manage to where you are financially, as opposed to intentionally leading your church to a culture of giving that will abundantly fund what God has called you to do. 3 conversations with churches just yesterday, and this is where churches tend to be. If there are 100 households that attend your church, which is about a typical size church in America, almost always the giving data looks like this. These are 100 households that if a neighbor said, where do you go to church? They would say, instantly, I go to church there. So it's not the I show up every other Easter thing. It's just there's some kind of an emotional, relational attachment there. 100 households, almost always, I can count on this. 50 of those 100, want to guess what they give to the church? 0, nada, nothing. Almost always the case. The next group, about 20 out of the 100, will give less than $1,200 a year. Now, for some, that's a substantial amount of money. For others, that's token giving. I like that $1,200 mark because, as I understand in research, our friends at Starbucks say their best customers are $1,200 a year and up at Starbucks. So if you're a gold card member, they really like you and pay attention to you if you're $1,200 and up. So 70 out of 100 households in most churches don't even meet a Starbucks level of giving. Isn't that fascinating? As we all rushed out to get the caffeine at break on that. So it's a legally addictive substance. I get it. 30 out of 100 households will abundantly fund or will fund the bulk of the revenue. So yesterday, 2 churches that I spoke with. Church number 1, 2 years old, rapidly growing in a metro area suburb, and they're going gangbusters. Really, 2 years old, just doing great. Their giving data, just like that. Half give nothing, 20% give a token gift, and 30% fund about 80% of the ministry. Second church, well over 30 years, established an icon in the community in the upper Midwest, and guess what? Their giving data looked just the same. But here was the theme that was also present with each of those pastors. They said, Brad's interpretation here, I'm going to wet my pants if I have to talk about faith and finances here. I don't even know how to do that. And both pastors were under 50. Both were very experienced in pastoral leadership. And they said, basically, I don't know what to do. And it freaks me out to be able to do that. So we want to help guide you as pastors as to how to abundantly fund your churches and move away from where most churches are, and that is just marginally funded and people not growing in faith and finances. Where you can be up here. It's not that hard if you're intentional and purposeful in your pastoral leadership about it. And here's the thing, though, it's more incremental in getting there than it is preaching a sermon and having a breakthrough, rah-rah moment of, okay, let's all gather around and start giving. Now, it's much more incremental, building a culture over time, and you as a pastor get to do that. So you can be abundantly funded. 3 reasons why you as a pastor should invest in growing the giving culture of your church. Number 1, it accelerates spiritual growth. There's something about dealing with faith and finances that accelerates people coming to understand the character of God in a fresh way. Money is our currency. Money is how we keep score, particularly in American culture. It represents our loves. It represents our priorities. So inviting somebody into the spiritual process of getting a grip on their faith and finances is the fastest way to grow them spiritually. I was halfway through seminary before God exposed this in my own little world. I was shocked. I could parse Greek, couldn't do diddly with Hebrew, but I was decent with Greek, and I had no idea about the whole faith and finance conversation. And here's why. Because at the core of my heart, I'm a greedy guy. It's just, I get scared when I don't have financial security. So what is it which causes me to have greed? I have an incorrect view of the character of God. If I have a right view of God about how sovereign he is and faithful he is and trusting and loving, all the things that Kathy talked about earlier, if I had a correct view of the person and character of God, all that would be squashed. But because of some family background and the way God has apparently, or the way I'm wired, I'm very attuned to greed in my heart and how I protect against that. Lisa and I are envelope people. We each month grab cash, put it in the envelope. It's the way we manage our finances. Just a difference in marriages here. Lisa's goal when the envelopes that she controls is to empty the envelopes as quickly as possible in the month. In her view, it's what it's there for, right? Let's spend it. And then around the 25th of the month, I hear this, is the Bank of Brad open? Like, woman? No. You know, how many years do we have? How many times do we have to go through this? My goal is to have fat envelopes. How little can I spend in the envelope each month and get fat? I want to move from a legal size envelope to like a 9 by 12, and that's my goal because I'm wired differently. I'm wired around money because at the core of my heart, money is an idol. It represents security. So it changes how I behave. Now, does giving come naturally to me with a greedy heart? Nope. And Lisa mocks me a lot. What do you tell me again what you do? Teach churches about giving and generosity? Yeah, that's what I do. Mumble, mumble, mumble. So yeah, we have fun with that. My greatest spiritual growth has come around how God has taught me to be generous. Sometimes kicking and screaming, and sometimes with the joy of the Lord at the heartbeat of that, because somebody said somewhere it's more blessed than to, who was that? Who said that? Shakespeare? Oh yeah, Jesus. So, pastoring people through the spiritual process accelerates spiritual growth. That's also important because our culture is under attack. Giving to churches is depressed right now. Now, giving in general is on the upswing. Giving to religious causes is on an upswing, but largely that's because of very wealthy people giving at a greater level. Most of us in a giving context of churches are finding it harder and harder to give. The average college graduate leaves with about $30,000 of student debt right now. Isn't that interesting? Wow, $30,000 of student debt. Cost of living has increased over the last decade, but basically wages have remained flat. It's very hard to walk into a giving context here, which is why 70 out of 100 households in a church are not giving in a meaningful level. About 6 weeks ago, I had a conversation with a millennial couple. Millennial is being defined as under 35 in this context. Raised in Christian homes, cool kids, just amazing. He had three little kids, or four little kids, and under the age of 8, whatever it was, nice kids. They were asleep, so I didn't interact with them at all. So they said, would you look at our budget and tell us where because it's killing us. So their combined household income was above the median U.S. income level. So here we look at their budget here, walking through, see what they have on a house payment, no consumer debt at all, no student loans, those are paid off. So look at electricity, all those things, and basically they were out of money, but I looked at the giving category and they were given $65 a month. One was to like a Compassion International kid, and another was to a missionary for about $25 a month. And my question was, where's giving to your church? And they said, it's driving us crazy. We just can't figure out how to do that. We want to, but we don't know how. So, well, where's your pastor? And help, I don't know. He's not talking to us at all about that. Missed moment. For you in pastoral leadership, what a great opportunity to introduce to the concept of stewardship and allow them to get a grip around giving and prioritizing giving as a spiritual discipline to find that joy of giving. More and more households in your church, whether they be boomer or builders or millennials or whatever generation, are finding tension points in giving, and you as a pastor and leaders can help them navigate those waters. So first reason you want to do this is that it accelerates spiritual growth. Second reason is that it's countercultural. Generosity is countercultural and surprises the world. Now, we all have a deep sense of faith in the scriptures, in our God, in Jesus, in the Holy Spirit, the triune God, all of these things. But in a postmodern world, all the classic Christian apologetics don't make any sense. You believe in a resurrection, that's fine for you, but it doesn't work for me. So the idea of classic apologetics is waning in the postmodern world. What really grabs people's attention is what we do with our possessions. Here's a quote from the 1st century. It's a letter from Dionysius to somebody named Matthetes. But it's interesting, this is a pagan worldview here. Let's walk this through together. For the Christians are distinguished from other men. They dwell in their own countries, but simply as sojourners. As citizens, they share in all things with others, and yet endure all things as if foreigners. Every foreign land is to them as their native country, and every land of their birth is a land of strangers. They marry, as they all do. They beget children. They do not destroy their offspring, which, by the way, was common in the Roman world. Oh, that was a little girl? No, thank you. We're going to destroy that child. Or I don't like how that kid looks. Off he goes. But Christians don't do that. They have a common table, but not a common bed. Sound a little familiar to at least the American culture now? They are in the flesh, but that they do not live after the flesh. They pass their days on earth, but they are citizens of heaven. They obey the prescribed laws, sometimes surpass the laws by their lives. They love all men, are persecuted by all. They're unknown and condemned. They're put to death and restored to life. They are poor, yet they make many rich. Wow. Wouldn't that be cool if somebody looked at your church and said, they're poor, but they make many rich? Most churches, if they disappeared out of the community, they would not be missed. If you have a church like this, they are poor yet make many rich. If your church disappeared, you would be missed. They are in lack of all things and yet abound in all When punished, they rejoice as if quickened to life. They are assailed by the Jews as foreigners and are persecuted by Greeks. Yet to those who hate them, they are unable to assign any reason for the hatred. One other quote from Tim Keller. The early church was strikingly different from the culture around it in its way. The pagan society was stingy with its money and promiscuous with its body. A pagan gave nobody their money and practically gave everybody their body. And then the Christians, you and me, came along and gave practically nobody their body, and they gave practically everybody their money. Wow, wouldn't it be so interesting culturally if there was a dramatic shift within the church and we so handled our finances that it blew the culture away? That's the second reason why, as a pastor leader, you get to do this. Third reason, you get to abundantly fund what you're doing. Isn't it more fun and better to do ministry when you have the financial resources to do that? Yes, it is. Some of you paused and actually had to think that through. Would that be better? Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Wouldn't it be good to leave the scarcity mentality and find yourself abundantly funded? I'm not talking about prosperity theology or any of that foolishness there, but understanding that engaging pastorally with your church can lead to increased financial giving. There's some barriers to giving as to why it's hard for us as pastors and leaders to do this. Fear. What will people say? I don't know how to do this. Oftentimes I find that pastors are cautious or reluctant to talk about giving because their private world does not align with what they know they should be doing. I had an interaction with a church last week that was awkward. The church had invited me in to help them develop some capital to expand their building and fix some things up. And there were some in the church that were very antagonistic. They were thundering, giving is between God and me, and no man is going to know this. And we don't want to engage in this whole concept of faith and finances. Almost always when I run across that with a church, it means that leader is not giving. They're just throwing up a smokescreen and saying, I'm going to make some noise and I'm going to throw some Bible verses out there and look really spiritual because I do not want to be exposed in the fact that I'm not giving. Worked with a pastor in Florida last year who does not know what people give. And most of the churches where I work, the pastors don't know the details of giving, and that's not pertinent at all. It either works if you do know or it works if you don't know. We can figure it out either way with that. So he was with another staff leader, and he said, even though I don't know, I'm pretty sure I know who the top 5 givers are in our church. And the other staffer, you could tell they had a good relationship and they were playful with each other. And he said, dare you to name them? Johnson Smith, yeah, done. You got 1 right out of the 5. In fact, the other 4, says the staff person who knows the giving, the other 4 are not even in the top 50. And you could see the shock on his face of, you've got to be kidding me. What in the world is that? And then we found out a little bit later that the pastor was in the top 10 of giving in the church. And he went through the stages of grief. He went through denial and all those things, anger, and then he came to grips with, wow, that's pretty bleak if I'm in the top 10. And for many of you as pastors, you're probably in the top 10. And you can figure out if that's a good thing or a bad thing in your context. So some of the barriers: fear, family background. For me, family background led to my greed. My parents came through and my grandparents came through the Depression. The man was always out to get us. You're going to lose it if you're not careful. That had a great bearing in my family background and causes me on my worldview of giving. Not knowing how, your community and context. Sometimes communities are I worked with a church recently. They're in a brutal community where they had many, many hundreds of givers, and just very few gave more than $100 a year because they were in that kind of community. So a lot of reasons, the barriers as to why it would be challenged. Normalizing giving is a major pastoral, shepherding, and leadership responsibility. This is, if anything I could get across to pastors, it would be giving is not just a business transaction. Giving is transformational in life and heart. We talk about giving as if we're buying something in the marketplace and we'll receipt it and say thank you, and here's our budget, and here's how we're living on the balance sheet and the P&L statement over here. And we tend to compartmentalize the giving into this transactional category and ignore it from a pastoral sense. I would challenge you to move the giving responsibilities into the pastoral shepherding side of things, because it's transformational. If you take care of somebody's heart, the money follows. If you're just driving for money and working it from a transactional standpoint, the money rarely follows. It's a major pastoral responsibility. What I'd like to walk through for the next few minutes is to understand how to build a generosity culture in your church. In this diagram, this is the extent of my artistic talent right here. I got nothing musically and I got nothing artistically, but I can do two triangles. The triangle on the left, this is how money flows in the world. God somehow has created the world economically to flow like this. For those of you that are business owners, your revenue stream looks like this. For those of you in pastoral leadership, your church giving pattern looks like this. The triangle on the left is the number of people, and the triangle on the right is the amount of dollars that would be given. This is also known as the 80-20 rule and other pieces, but this is how giving flows in a church, and we saw that with some of the illustrations that we gave earlier. So at the top part of that triangle, a very small number of people that give a disproportionate amount of the total. Oftentimes, in a church context, the top of that triangle is about 4 to 6% of your givers. The next block down, the mid-green, would be leaders. More mature Christ followers who have greater experience in giving and greater experience in these areas, more in number, but generally have less to give to the greater amount. And then you have everybody else at the bottom, and they give very minimalistically. So as a pastor, as a leader, we want to begin to think strategically and shrewdly about how money flows. So in that top part, as a pastor, you're asking the question, how do I engage those who have surplus dollars to give? How do I disciple them in the grace of giving? Worked with a pastor 2 years ago, and he was bragging about, in a godly way, I suppose, about the top 3 givers of his church. And one was well over $100,000, and there was another one at about $71,000. Anybody want to sign up for that kind of giving? Patter, like, hey, count me in. So he was barking around the second family. I said, go have a conversation with them and find out what's going on as we were thinking through how to fund part of their ministry. And he called me and he said, I'm a bad pastor. He actually used other words that probably shouldn't share here. He said, I'm a bad pastor. I said, okay, tell me about it. It was funny. It was a good moment there. And he said, I found out through a casual conversation, this guy's base income is $12 million a year. And he has stock options on top of that. Okay. Anybody want to sign up for $12 million a year? Count me in. And I said, why are you a bad pastor? And he said, he's not even close to stewarding what God has entrusted to him well. He said, how is it that I engage in their world to help them understand how to steward the resources that God has given them, and then how to direct that to God's kingdom, and particularly how to direct that to the church? Now, very few people make $12 million a year, But in your church context, there are those that have surplus dollars to give, and it's your responsibility as a pastor to coach them up in that. What is God asking you to do as a steward? In the pastoral role in that second group, your job as a pastor is to lead well and to model and to say thank you and to encourage and to help drive them as leaders to understand the priority of giving and the priority of giving to their local church. It doesn't take much to make that happen. And then down at the bottom tier, lots and lots of people who've yet to figure this out. You get to introduce them to the spiritual discipline of giving and stewardship and helping them come to grips with the person and character of God and how finances impact their world. Huge life change comes when you as pastors work in that bottom tier of the left-hand circle, or at the left-hand circle, left side of the triangle there. So the idea is to continue to move people up in that. So we want to find new people to come to our church and invite them into the grace of giving. Those that are already there, to woo them into giving, and up we go. That's one of the ways that we abundantly fund the church. All right, let's take a look. What can you do now through December 2017 as pastors to grow your giving? We're going to be as practical as we can be and walk out with this. Back to generis.com/GCI. There are other resources there that are free that you can take and rip off and do whatever. We build them and give them away for you so you know how to go do this stuff. So let's take a look at what you can do as a pastor. Number one is a personal assessment. Where are you in giving? Classic leadership principle: speed of the leadership, speed of the team. You as a pastor cannot ask anybody to do something that you yourself are not already doing. I can walk into a pastor's office and very quickly understand if they're in over their head financially or if they're wildly generous to their church. It's so easy to tell. And then I ask them, and they always say, well, you know, or they got to figure it out. So first step is, where are you in giving? And sometimes life throws some curves at us, and we get all that. I was talking to a pastor, this is in California, and he said, love this guy. He was just a nut, but a fantastic pastor. And he said, I know exactly what I give. So right now, through the first whatever months of the year, I know exactly where we are. And he said, I am so confident of that, I'm going to call the person who has the records and just watch. So he was strutting his stuff, and they called, and he said, tell me where I'm at in giving. And his face just fell, and he thought, we haven't given anything for 5 months? What's wrong with that? So classic case, not that this ever happened in my marriage or your marriage, but it was one of those, hey, honey, didn't you agree to take over that giving thing to the church? No, knucklehead. You said that you were going to do that. And they both thought they were each doing it, and they hadn't given for 5 months. And they thought they were, and yet there was a major gap. So they made up for it that week, and yuck, fun. But other times, it is because of a spiritual issue or something, a heart condition that you need to assess. So take a look at your own giving and ask yourself, is giving prioritized in my world, and is it prioritized to my church? So a personal assessment is where you need to start, because you cannot ask somebody to give if you yourself are not giving. Leadership alignment and permissions. I talked to a church Tuesday, and the pastor and their lay leadership group, churches have many ways that they lead, they were not in agreement. The pastor understood, we've got to change this, and the leadership over here was saying, over our dead body, and the pastor, you could tell, was going, I can arrange that, because I'm pretty ticked about that. You want dead bodies? I think I can deliver dead bodies around here on the inside. On the outside is a different story with that one. So just make sure that your leaders are aligned with where you're going to go. I invited a church that was beginning to emerge from not normalizing generosity, and they were okay on their finances and their income, but they wanted to go further. They wanted to go more to fund what God was asking them to do. So we asked the leaders to say, would you all commit publicly together to say that I give to this church, and giving to this church is the highest priority in my giving? And you would have thought that I'd ask them to offer their firstborn child to a foreign god. Well, we don't think that's anybody's business, says one. Well, I know you're not giving anything here. You just don't want to be exposed. It took them about 4 months worth of meetings to figure out, yes, we want to be accountable to each other and transparent enough in our giving to say we as leaders of the church will be aligned and in agreement and in sync going forward in our giving. Again, because speed of the leader, speed of the team. You cannot ask a congregation to do something that you yourself are not able to do. So perhaps before the month of August, and your leadership or your staff or key volunteers, however you're running your church, ask the question, is giving to this church the top priority in your giving? And if not, why not? Let's figure it out. Put it out there and talk about it and understand what is going on in terms of preventing somebody from giving abundantly to your church. So leadership alignment and permissions. Mission clarity, telling your church story. Brag on what God does. Rather than send out an email, if you do that in your church, and talk about the programs and don't forget to sign up and go to the retreat, brag on what God is doing. Tell stories of where God is in the move. I've heard some of the stories just walking around here today. There's some people praying out here, having fun, and what's God doing in your heart? Brag on what God is doing, because people want to give where God is on the move. People want to give to where their money has impact. They don't want to give to meet a budget. They don't want to give just to be nice to the church. And they'll be nice to you and give you something, but all the fun giving goes someplace where you see deep life impact, where God is moving. Most of the time, churches are horrible at telling their story and bragging on what God is doing, and givers go, okay, but look over here. I can invest money and get fresh water wells in a country, and I can save children from sex slavery, and I can create a medical ship that goes around the world. That's the fun giving right there. Brag on what God is doing in your church so that givers would say, I want to make my church the top priority because God is at move here in my church. Connect giving to personal spiritual growth into your church. Build up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither rust nor moth destroy. Isn't it interesting that we can live in light of eternity? So there's a spiritual benefit to giving. So help people understand that there's benefit to giving. There's joy in giving. There's theological truth in giving. Invite people into that story. This is perhaps the easiest one, the offering moment. Most of you, I'm assuming, will have some kind of an offering moment in your worship experience, a basket, a plate, or a box in the back, or something like that. Most churches just run through the motions of passing the plate and the basket. You can take 60 to 90 seconds before every offering and revolutionize giving in your church. Easiest place to start. If you go back to that generous.com/GCI, you can find a book that says, here's how you do your offering moments. Take it, follow it, it'll give you a script to go by, and it's a lot of fun to go figure that out. Most churches fumble the ball around the offering moment. Here is one. This is a nationally known church that many of you would know. I was visiting in worship, and massive auditorium, historic building, and they said, now it's time for God's tithes and our offerings. And I thought, there are probably about 15 people in this room that understand the distinction between God's tithes and our offering, right? I mean, most of us can pretty much guess what that is, but the vast majority of people go, whatever, in blah, 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 blah. But it's time for God's tithes and offering. They had the usher team. It was like a synchronized swimming in the Olympics. They poured out of these doors. I don't know where. They all had these very nice suits. The men had nice suits, and the women were very nicely dressed. They all had earbuds with little talking together here. And there was a woman over here on the side, had a stopwatch. And she's counting. This is scripted. You got 38 seconds to get that offering done. So the offering hit me. I wasn't going to give, but I thought, because I'm greedy, right? I wasn't prepared to give. But even if I wanted to, assuming I had a checkbook with me, by the way, anybody have checkbooks with them today? Yeah. 10 years ago, most of you would have flashed it around. Very few of us have checkbooks here. The offering moment presumes that somebody shows up with a check or cash, right? And most of us don't have it. That's a different topic for a little bit later. So the basket hit me, and there's no way on the planet I could have given anything. But you could see that they were going to be on time, and they were not going to go off script with that. So did they get money? Yes. Did they miss an opportunity to encourage people in the grace of giving? Absolutely. It was a transaction, not a transformational moment. Giver communication. I helped a pastor today to craft a letter about this, a giving summary for the first 6 months of giving to their church. It was really fun to put into that letter, this is what God has done and what God is going to do. So your end of the year giving, your annual statements, these are all parts of things that you can do to raise your giving. Biblical teaching, don't be afraid to teach through what the scriptures say about giving. There are very good samples out there and models of which to go by. And do model. An offering moment that I love to teach pastors is to say, by the way, as your pastor, you need to know about my giving patterns at our church. My spouse and I, we give the very first of the month. We give through an automatic bill pay through our church, through our bank. It's the best money that we invest all month. Wow. How much does that pastor give? Doesn't matter. Is it a priority? Yes. Is he, she giving to the church? Yes. So modeling is vital. You can change giving trajectory to abundantly fund your church. You can do this. You don't have to live by shrinking your mission and vision. You can do this. Giving you some tracks to run on here. I am around through the balance of the couple days. Would love to chat with you about your own church situation. I got nothing to do tonight, so I'll hang out in the lobby and talk as much as you need to get you going. And there you go. Thank you. You can do this. Go do it.